by the research scholars of Sanskrit philosophy and Indic Studies. The speaker for the day today is Dr. Amrita Banerjee, and the topic is Decolonizing Solidarity and Reciprocity, a Feminist Philosophical Perspective on Ethics Across Difference. I request Sandra to give the welcome address.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Shefali. Good afternoon to each one of you present today for this session on Decolonizing Solidarity and Reciprocity, a Feminist Philosophical Perspective on Ethics Across Difference. On behalf of School of Sanskrit Philosophy and Indic Studies, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome the eminent personality and speaker for today's session, Dr. Amrita Banerjee. Dr. Amrita Banerjee is an associate professor of philosophy at Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. She received her Ph.D. in philosophy and graduate certificate in women's and gender studies from the University of Oregon, USA. Banerjee was an assistant professor of philosophy at Allegheny College, Pennsylvania, USA, prior to joining IIT Bombay. She specialized in moral and socio-political philosophy, which she approaches from the perspective of feminist philosophy, classical pragmatism, and 20th century continental philosophy. Madam Banerjee focuses on marginalized intellectual spaces within philosophy, and especially works by women philosophers and philosophers of color within these traditions. She is also interested in decolonizing Western philosophy and engaging with hegemonic traditions from a transnational feminist perspective. Her papers have appeared in prestigious journals such as Journal of Speculative Philosophy, the Pluralist, and Philosophy in Contemporary World. She is also an co-editor of the Social Issues of Philosophy in Contemporary World titled Mothering from the Margins. We welcome you, Madam Dr. Amrita Banerjee. It is a privilege for all of us to have you here. We welcome also the Dean of Schools of Sanskrit Philosophy and Indic Studies, Professor Koshi. At the same time, the other faculty members of the department and the school, that is Ma'am Sanjot, Dr. Walter Rajvi. We also welcome the faculties from other institutions who are present here to address and to attend this session. Also welcome all the research scholars who have put in efforts to be present here and to organize this talk, and other all participants of this session. Welcome to one and all. I hand over to Shefali.
Thank you, Sandra. A note to the participants. The event is being recorded, and so also the comments in the chat. Kindly keep your microphones on mute throughout the lecture. The lecture will be followed by a question and answer session. I request Professor Koshi Tharakan, Dean of School of Sanskrit Philosophy and Indic Studies, to welcome the guest.
Yeah, on behalf of the School of Sanskrit Philosophy and Indic Studies at Goa University, I extend a warm welcome to you all, particularly to today's speaker, Professor Amrita Banerjee from IIT Bombay. Amrita and myself, we know each other quite well and we are good friends. But beyond that, I value her scholarship in this, particular domain of philosophy, which is not worked quite adequately in our institutions and universities in India. So I can say that Professor Amrita Banerjee is one of the leading philosophers working in this area. She has published in very reputed journals like Hypatia and Speculative Journal and anthologies, contributed to anthologies and all. So she has been consistently working in this domain of feminist philosophy. I mean, using the feminism as a theoretical lens to look at the various issues in political and social philosophy. So today she would be speaking to us on a very interesting topic, decolonizing solidarity and reciprocity within a feminist, using a feminist framework. So I look forward to the scholarly presentation, and I once again welcome you all. We have also with us other faculty members from the university and colleges, philosophy faculty members from the affiliated colleges, even outside Goa. Also, I could see some of the senior faculty colleagues like Professor Ranjit Ghose and others. So I welcome you all. Back to you, Shefali.
Thank you, sir. I now invite Dr. Banerjee to deliver her address.
Thank you so much. First of all, let me begin by thanking the School of Sanskrit Philosophy and Indic Studies at Goa University. It's a new school, and I hope that it grows and flourishes in the years to come. Special thanks to Professor Koshi. As he mentioned, we know each other for quite some time. We are good friends, and we are also we are very interested in each other's scholarships and the areas of research. A special thanks to Vidya Mary George, who's a research scholar in Goa University, for being so patient and following up with me, sending me reminders for all sorts of things. So Vidya, thank you so much. And of course, thanks to the audience that's here to attend the talk today. It's my pleasure to speak in front of you. So just to give set some context for the talk today, this talk is actually a part of my overall research over the years on thinking about what ethics across difference entails, and how philosophically, particularly from the lens of feminist philosophy, we can contribute towards developing frameworks for ethics across difference, which is both decolonizing and liberatory at the same time. Also a lot of the work in moral philosophy has been focused, even when it speaks to issues of global ethics and difference, has been done from the vantage point of the dominant mainstream traditions, like deontology, virtue ethics, consequentialism, etc. And over the past few decades, feminist philosophers have devised new frameworks such as the ethics of care as alternative frameworks to address some of these issues. So, however, there has been a lot of debate about whether justice-based ethics is more appropriate or care-based ethics is more appropriate. Justice-based ethics designating mostly the mainstream traditions of ethics, and care-based ethics designating the feminist care ethics tradition. And so there's been a lot of debate over the last, again, a couple of decades in terms of whether justice-based paradigms are better or care-based paradigms are better for thinking about ethical issues. Now, in a way, my work both engages with both of these paradigms, but at the same time also moves beyond this sort of debate in a way. Now, the talk today is primarily based on two recent articles, and I'm just giving you the reference in case you would like to like more details. So the first article is called De-colonizing Solidarity and Reciprocity, and it has appeared this year itself in Routledge, Oxford and New York. It's been published together by Routledge, Oxford and New York. And it's in an anthology called The Imbecile's Guide to Public Philosophy. So today's talk primarily draws from this article, but it also has references to another article which came out in 2021, which is called A Transnational Intervention into an Ethic of Care. And this has come out in an anthology called Transnational Feminisms. The anthology is called Feminist and Queer Theory, an Intersectional and Transnational Reader. It is edited by L. Ayu Saraswati and Barbara Shaw and has come out from New York, Oxford. So today's talk is primarily based on these two articles, and the first one specifically in more detail. Now, conceptualizing feminist ethics, transnational feminist ethics, or for that matter, any feminist ethics across differences, is a mammoth task. The very possibility of such ethic in some way depends on productive conceptualizations of responsibility, solidarity, and reciprocity towards the other. Yet, I think that concepts such as solidarity and reciprocity elude philosophical definition in simplistic terms, such as on the grounds of abstract or formal qualities as common humanity or the commonality of oppression. I will come to this point in section 1 in greater detail, but I think defining these concepts in these terms is quite simplistic in a world marked by unequal distribution, unequal access to resources, and conflict between parties on different sides of privilege. So when we are talking about ethics across difference, we have to engage with all these inequalities and stratifications that are part of both the local and the global sphere. So this talk is one small step in an effort to build a better philosophical model for these concepts. Hence the title of the talk in terms of solidarity and reciprocity. Now, one point I would like to emphasize is that groups coming together in solidarity are confronted by internal differences, fragmentations, and multiplicity of identities. And these internal differences must also be recognized and grappled with so as not to foreclose the possibility of minority voices within groups from expressing themselves, and to prevent the homogenization of group-based identities. So this is a very important point, I think, to sort of appreciate that solidarity is not simply an intergroup concern, which of course it is, but it is also an intra-group concern. If we take groups themselves to be dynamic entities and consider identities to be fluid and evolving. In another paper called Dynamic Borders, Dynamic Identities, which was published in Contemporary Feminist Pragmatism, that's the anthology, Routledge, New York in 2012. I had argued that, a part of developing this sort of transnational feminist ethos is to also come up with more non-monadic interactive conceptions, philosophical conceptions of group identity as the unit of moral ontology or political ontology. So that's just, I wanted to refer to that part of the work, which I'm not actually taking up today, but this emphasizes that solidarity is an intra-group matter as much as it is an intergroup matter. Now, I claim that the concept of solidarity in its turn is intimately tied to the idea of reciprocity between members of a group. Therefore, productive definitions of both are needed in order to decolonize theory and praxis across differences. Although I focus on feminist solidarities for the purpose of my analysis, the philosophical framework I outline may be useful for resolving various quandaries around building solidarity across other identity-based movements as well, because this is a kind of philosophical model for thinking about solidarity as such. Moreover, at the end of the talk, I will argue that the new framework enables us to envision a robust ethics of recognition across difference and orients us towards what I term an ethics of humility. Now, I'll begin my analysis with a consideration of relevant tools offered by two of the dominant traditions in feminist moral and social philosophy, namely liberal feminism and an ethic of care. I argue that neither the liberal take on reciprocity nor the care ethics alternative of shifting moral gravity to non-reciprocal relations are viable philosophical positions for transnational ethics. If we are to avoid not just cultural imperialism, but what I call epistemological and ethical colonialisms, we need to preserve some notion of reciprocity albeit not in its purely liberal form, but we need to reconceptualize it in a new way. For this, I work out a philosophical perspective, and my perspective is actually inspired by women philosophers, philosophers of color, and also the existential phenomenology of Simone de Beauvoir, who are not typically invoked in this debate, particularly Beauvoir's philosophy. Through a detailed analysis of the concept of ambiguity, particularly in Beauvoir's philosophy in section 1 of the talk, along with the phenomenology of agency entailed by it, which I speak about in section 2, I then go on to articulate a revised conception of reciprocity in section 3. This is going to be the roadmap for the talk. It's divided into these 3 sections. I argue that reciprocity redefined is able to ground claims for solidarity across differences without covering over differences and running into the errors of traditional liberal conceptualization on the one hand and regressive versions of difference-based feminisms on the other. While my analysis takes a start from the concept of ambiguity offered by Simone de Beauvoir, the philosophical framework, along with the new conceptualizations of reciprocity and solidarity, goes beyond the contours of Beauvoir's existential phenomenology at the same time. So with this sort of backdrop in mind, let me now get into section 1, which will basically critically consider existing positions on solidarity and reciprocity in feminist philosophy. Solidarity is not an easy concept to contend with. One way in which traditional Western liberal feminism, the dominant tendency within mainstream Western feminism in its first and second waves, resolved the question of solidarity was through the lens of sisterhood. Fighting for gender justice meant uniting as sisters in struggle against patriarchy, and securing gender justice primarily implied securing gender equality. Liberal philosophical notions of equality and reciprocity have always been central to liberal feminist moral and social paradigms and have worked hand in hand with each other. So equality, reciprocity has been tied very closely with the concept of equality. And then later I will talk about how equality then has been understood in terms of symmetry and commensurability. So this is the connection I will outline in a little bit. But to begin with, the liberal philosophical notions of equality and reciprocity have worked in conjunction with each other. The demand for equality in the sense of equal rights, opportunity, and voice on the part of equal rights feminism of this kind entailed a demand for reciprocity between the genders. According to the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, one of the first historic documents for feminism in the West, quote, that woman is man's equal and the highest good of the race demands that she should be recognized as such, unquote. This is a quotation from this document. Here we find the intertwining of the concepts of equality and reciprocity within the liberal paradigm. Looking closely, I think it may even be said that demand for recognition tends to translate as a simultaneous demand for reciprocity. Philosopher and queer ethicist Eva Kitte, while subjecting liberalism, especially the Rawlsian kind, to critique, identifies one defining element of equality as being symmetry, whereby, quoting from her book Love's Labor, she writes, the parties engaged in a moral exchange in the context of social cooperation, as Rawls would put it, the parties are equally situated with respect to one another, unquote. Now, as we know, social cooperation within classical and modern liberalism is understood in terms of, is based on a social contract where parties are involved in exchange of certain basic goods. So here, Kitte is basically talking about how one defining feature of equality between the parties is symmetry, where they are situated equally with respect to one another. In any case, Kitte demonstrates this link between equality and symmetry, or rather symmetry as being an integral aspect of the liberal understanding of equality through citing Rawls. Again, quoting from her, quote, they, that is the parties to the contract, the social contract, must each benefit or share in common burdens in some appropriate fashion judged by a suitable benchmark of comparison, unquote. Here, Kitty is basically sort of referring to Rawls's view. When equality is conceived as symmetry, this is the important point, when equality is conceived as symmetry, then it entails reciprocity. A liberal understanding of reciprocity takes it to signify conscious interrelation between autonomous equals, marked by mutual sharing, benefit, and exchange. Moreover, as feminist philosophers such as Iris Marianne Young, Sela Ben-Habib, etc. have pointed out, this understanding of equality and reciprocity, moral agents are also assumed to be transparent to each other. This is because the moral relation, to use Ben-Habib's distinction, is conceived as being towards a generalized other and not a concrete other. So when we look at moral agency, etc., through the lens of deontology, consequentialism, etc., it almost seems that one moral agent is substitutable by the other, because the claim for moral entitlement emanates from what is same between us. Right, so either humanity or rationality or something of that sort. So one of the criticism of feminist ethics against mainstream ethics has been that here in the mainstream tradition, the moral obligation is considered to be towards a generalized other, not a concrete other with particular histories, needs, social relations, and so on. So now this emphasis, I think that this emphasis on the generalized other includes an assumption of commensurability between moral agents. And it's an epistemic commensurability that we are talking about. So in sum, the model of a contract between autonomous and equal parties where equality is understood as a symmetrical and commensurable relation becomes the primary frame for understanding just social cooperation and moral obligation. Right. So the symmetry and commensurability clause are very important in the liberal understanding of reciprocity. And Kitty, in fact, calls this model equality-based reciprocity. That's her characterization of this model. Now, I think that in its attempt to ensure gender justice through a politics of equality-based reciprocity, the model I just described, traditional Western liberal feminisms, especially in its first and second waves, also ended up forging a relationship between solidarity and the liberal notion of reciprocity. This is due to the fact that this position implicitly assumed equality between women in the sense of both symmetry and commensurability. The assumption of symmetry meant that there was no need to problematize the category woman and examine whether it could be fractured by diverse experiences, locations, and power differentials. In other words, women were assumed to be an inherently coherent group. Commensurability was assumed through an appeal to a generalized conception of oppression that women face as women. Symmetry and commensurability, rooted in this kind of gender essentialism, in turn, served as the twin basis for thinking about solidarity and the ethical space between women across differences. Gender essentialism, so gender essential on the basis of this, basically because we all suffer a common oppression, we can come together and think of our moral relations in terms of the model of sisterhood, is the idea. Gender essentialism has come under fire as a basis for feminist theory and praxis from various theoretical perspectives, such as women of color feminisms in the West, post-colonial feminisms, and third world feminisms, to name a few, due to its colonizing impulse towards difference. Several problems, of course, have been pointed out with the liberal feminist conception of reciprocity. And I want to refer to 3 or 4 problems in this regard. Feminists of color, firstly, feminists of color, post-colonial feminists, and third world feminists challenge the idea of common oppression as a basis of arguing for commensurability. They do so by highlighting the intersectional nature of identities, the diversity in women's issues, and the conflict between women on the same issue. When class, race, caste, citizenship status, diverse histories, power structures, etc., significantly separate groups of women from each other, then chances of them coming together in solidarities as equals are extremely rare and difficult. Additionally, I have argued elsewhere that the assumption of common oppression commits a reductive fallacy, thereby giving way to a borderless feminist political perspective of global sisterhood, which has no sensitivity towards local contexts of struggle and differences within an identity category, such as woman or feminist for that matter. The outcome is dangerous. It potentially can transform feminism into yet another colonizing narrative. Any claim to symmetry and reciprocity in the senses discussed so far are therefore particularly problematic. By questioning the very basis on which to ground solidarity, the post-colonial critiques of mainstream liberal feminist politics expose the problem with this framework for thinking about solidarity as sisterhood. Second criticism comes very interestingly from a Latin American feminist philosopher called Ophelia Schutter, who I think makes an important contribution to the discussion of commensurability and incommensurability in feminist ethics and politics through her essay called Cultural Alterity. Schutter reminds us of the urgency for preserving and celebrating incommensurability in cross-cultural feminist communication. Contrary to the popular conception of incommensurability in arithmetic terms as, quote, a kind of minus effect to cross-cultural communication, unquote, something that only detracts from communication, Schutter is eager to explore and foreground the transformative potential of incommensurability for a decolonizing feminist ethics and politics. She therefore pushes us to think of incommensurability by looking at, quote, nodes in a linguistic interchange or a conversation in which the other's speech or some aspect of it resonates in me as a kind of strangeness, as a kind of displacement of the usual expectation, unquote. Within intercultural exchange, often a speaker may say something that falls on the side of the unsaid or the incoherent for the culturally different interlocutor. This happens due to the presence of difficult to understand and truly incommensurable elements in addition to readily understandable elements, argues Schutter. She urges that it is important not to bypass the latter or subsume them under an already familiar category in such contexts. Cultural alterity requires that the other be heard in their difference, their specificity, rather than as a generalized type. So partly this contributes also to the feminist ethicist critique about the generalized other, right? That we miss a lot about the other when we simply sort of look at the other as a generalized other and not a concrete other. Schutter's analysis, I think, reiterates the problem with assuming any simplistic notion of commensurability within reciprocal exchanges, and I push this further as demonstrating the need for accommodating incommensurability in any form of decolonizing ethics. I'll return to this at the end after I have redefined reciprocity, this whole the sort of how then it ties back into the debate around commensurability. Third critique of the liberal conception of reciprocity that I would like to consider is provided by one of the central proponents of an ethic of care, namely Eva Kitte. Kitte's critique is famous in moral and political philosophy as the dependency critique of Rawls. The dependency critique is a critique of the liberal conceptions of equality and reciprocity at the same time. Through her dependency critique, Kitte emphasizes the sorts of relationships that are extreme forms of dependencies and vulnerabilities, which prevent a huge proportion of individuals, all vulnerable populations, from entering into a contractual mode of ethical relations. And this contractual mode defines the moral relation between parties in terms of symmetry and commensurability. And Kitte's point is that for those that are vulnerable and those that care for the vulnerable, they cannot really enter into these sort of symmetric and commensurable relations because of due to their dependency or because they are caring for another, and that creates a secondary vulnerability. So vulnerability for Kitte can be physical, such as age-related or physical ability-related, or social, such as disadvantages due to social location. Her point is that disregarding dependencies along with the material vulnerabilities and asymmetries involved allow us to pretend autonomy for moral agents. Kite, therefore, and actually feminist ethicists broadly speaking, therefore emphasize vulnerability, factoring in vulnerability conceptually into moral and political philosophy in a very robust way. Kite claims that the models of equality-based reciprocity is a flawed center of moral gravity and a flawed framework for conceiving of ethical relations. Since care ethicists like Kite, Noddings, Tronto, Held, etc., find it problematic to base normative notions, moral claims, and political philosophy on liberal notions of reciprocity, they urge us to look towards non-contractual relationships, and by implication also non-reciprocal relationships in the above sense, such as that between a dependent and or the care receiver and her caregiver as the primary site of moral meaning, and to actually model ethical relations around this sort of asymmetric relations, such as between the caregiver and the cared for. The ethos of care, therefore, becomes the normative standard for conceptualizing both interpersonal ethic and public ethic through calling for a model of a just society that conceives of itself as a system of nested dependencies rather than a collection of individual autonomous agents. So they basically rethink this political and moral ontology and bring in this idea of dependency, vulnerability, and an ethic committed to attending the needs for the concrete as opposed to the generalized other. I share Kite's concern with the liberal notion of reciprocity as the conscious interrelation between equals, especially because of its assumed connection with equality, conceived as symmetry and commensurability that I've already outlined. Because this conceptualization has the potential to cover over fundamental inequalities, asymmetries, and vulnerabilities across differences. Also, I agree that it is very important to open up adequate theoretical space for vulnerability in moral and political philosophy. While recognizing these, I am, however, somewhat apprehensive about the potential implications of shifting the point of moral departure primarily to non-reciprocal relations on the caregiver-care-receiver model as the primary philosophical paradigm for conceptualizing moral obligation, and as the best alternative to a liberal conception of reciprocity, at least when it comes to ethics across difference and transnational feminist ethics. My main concern with then adopting this paradigm as an alternative is that although I perceive, let me just say that I actually perceive a lot of virtues in the care paradigm and have engaged with it extensively in the course of my work. But I think when it comes to a transnational feminist ethics, a critical engagement with the care paradigm is also important. And in the other paper on a transnational intervention into the ethic of care, I have argued for some of the reasons behind this. But my main concern has to do with the fact that a basic ontological asymmetry persists between the caregiver and cared for, whether the caregiver is an individual, a piece of public policy, or the state. This is problematic, particularly for my project of thinking about transnational feminist ethics. The concern I have is rooted in an important critique of hegemonic Western feminisms by feminists of color and post-colonial theorists. Often the understanding of women of color and women from developing nations is mediated by what Chandra Mohanty very aptly calls third world difference. Third world difference, according to her, is something that emerges in the light of the domination of the world system by the West, which conceives of itself as the first world, and the implicit assumption of Western feminist standards as being the paradigm for a liberatory feminist moral and social philosophy. Third world difference allows Western feminists to essentialize women of color, and anyone falling outside, and anyone who falls outside the purview of the first world and associate infantile qualities with them. The third world woman is rendered inessential, a being in general, rather than a certain kind of agent or subject. Viewed thus, being a third world woman automatically puts one in a non-reciprocal, that is a non-read also non-contractual relation to the first world woman, who is on this scheme in a better position to care and enlighten them. This is what I term as the threat of non-reciprocal objectification. And this can become a tool for perpetuating further oppression in the transnational sphere. So at the end of the day, my worry with simply substituting reciprocity with a focus on non-reciprocity as the primary paradigm of normative ethics is threefold. First, due to non-reciprocal objectification, we often see material relationships transforming into a mysterious normative standard. To explain, if the notion of reciprocity were completely stripped of moral force, non-reciprocal objectification, as I've described, would be a real threat. And it would be easy to mystify existing material inequality into normative non-reciprocities, that is, such as assuming epistemological and ethical asymmetries between the parties on the ground. Which has been by the case. The history of colonization has showed us how there are multiple discourses of moral and epistemological superiority and inferiority that is deployed. Turning normative force away from reciprocity, therefore, can potentially set in motion trajectories of practice that only accentuates the inequalities already in place. Second, it doesn't take long for reified asymmetry to translate into assumptions about epistemological and ethical hierarchy. After all, whatever or whoever is considered inessential always lies at the periphery of normativity. This is what I consider to be a form of epistemological and moral colonialism. These bar members of oppressed groups from being treated as equals and by implication as potential parties to any social or ethical contract. In fact, the whole project of Western imperialism was predicated precisely on such perceptions. The possibility of being treated as lower in epistemological and ethical hierarchies compared to her Western counterpart continues to be the dominant image of the third world woman and women of color in the West, in the dominant Western imaginary to this day, perpetuating ever new forms of neocolonialisms. Third, turning away from reciprocity and an excessive emphasis on non-reciprocity can inadvertently end up placing agency and its potential too heavily on one side of the relation. After all, the kind of power that a caregiver wields in relation to her charge in an act of care is often immense, actually desirable and unwise to question in some cases. Fourthly, even as we recognize intersectionality and differences, we do, however, need to evoke the language of solidarity in order to come together in common contexts of struggle against various forms of oppression. The way out, therefore, is to reconceptualize reciprocity and solidarity such that these are able to accommodate asymmetry and incommensurability. Note that the critiques that I have mentioned so far on the liberal paradigm was that the liberal conception of reciprocity cannot factor in asymmetry and incommensurability. So I think we need a conceptualization of reciprocity and solidarity that is able to accommodate asymmetry and incommensurability while not slipping into new kinds of common oppression narratives in the process. So we need, I think, to critically evaluate non-reciprocity as much as we should critically evaluate the liberal notion of reciprocity. Now, so at the end of the day, I consider it important to retain some notion of reciprocity, at least as a normative goal, while reconceptualizing it in a way such that its ties with equality conceived as symmetry and commensurability are loosened. To this end, I now turn towards section 2 of my talk, which tries to engage with the phenomenological concept of ambiguity and develop a specific conception of agency so as to rethink reciprocity and solidarity along the lines I have mentioned. This takes me to section 2, which is ambiguity, insights into the character of agency. Often, and especially in the context of feminist theory, we tend to focus our attention on the second sex when it comes to Simone de Beauvoir's work. In this essay, however, my focus is on Beauvoir's philosophical work preceding the second sex, with special emphasis on her conception of ambiguity. Ambiguity, as existential phenomenologists understand it, is an integral aspect of human experience and existence. In Beauvoir's work, which I'm focusing on here, she is a philosopher of ambiguity par excellence. The phenomenon of ambiguity provides the basis for the intersection of ethics, politics, and ontology. Perhaps the most poignant expression of this fundamental ambiguity of the human condition is the tension between transcendence, or our ability to transcend our situation, and immanence or facticity, or our experience of being bound to and determined by the situation. This tension not only establishes the point of contact with others, but also stipulates a specific trajectory for relating to others, that is, to envision an ethical political project from it. The possibilities for this is what I want to develop in the rest of the talk. Ever since her early essays, such as Pyrrhus and Cineas, Beauvoir begins to emphasize the tie between the self and the other, an emphasis which increases steadily through her later work. The other is central to the validation of individual projects. Projects are entire life plans and choices that link us to the world, help create an open future, and make the existential self possible. Since I am a freedom, not simply in a world of objects that are determined and can be manipulated at will, but rather among other freedoms who can talk back to me, affirm or negate the meaningfulness of my projects through the way they take these up or refuse to take these up, my fate is heavily influenced by the other. I need the other as freedom to respond to my calls and take up my goals in their own lives in order to provide substance to my goals. The other, conceived in this way, becomes a condition for the possibility of my project. Just as the other plays a role in confining me either to immanence or opening up the possibility of my transcendence, I play the same role for the other, according to Beauvoir. Berghofen clarifies, one of the Beauvoir scholars, she clarifies Beauvoir's position further when she writes, quote, "In embarking on my project, I also take on the task of creating a public to whom I can appeal. This public is essential to my project. It is through the project that I'm linked to / with others, and it is through these others that I, as my project, am linked to the future," unquote. In the Ethics of Ambiguity, Beauvoir introduces the distinction between two different kinds of freedom, which is quite unique in existential phenomenology. This distinction perhaps is an outcome of trying to reconcile the tension between a pure internal freedom with one that is manifest in experience. It could also have been proposed to deal with an ethical dilemma confronting the question of freedom in existential phenomenology, and particularly Sartre's treatment of it in Being and Nothingness, whose dichotomy between the in itself and the for itself results in a radical conception of freedom. Beauvoir's nuanced distinction between different kinds of freedom in Ethics of Ambiguity, I think, provides us with the ingredients for eventually outlining a more robust phenomenology of freedom as it is lived in different contexts of oppression versus privilege. Beauvoir clarifies at the very beginning of the Ethics of Ambiguity that freedom should not be viewed as a thing or a quality that is naturally attached to a thing. Insofar as a natural quality of a thing is concerned, we cannot get the thing apart from it. Therefore, natural qualities demand a binary vocabulary of description. It is either there or not there. I read Beauvoir's caution to not think of freedom as a thing or a natural quality as a call to not characterize it in the binary terms of absolute presence versus absolute absence, thus making its manifestation dependent on situation. And this will be very important for a philosophy of emancipation. Beauvoir then goes on to write, and I'm quoting her, "To will oneself free is to effect the transition from nature to morality by establishing a genuine freedom on the original upsurge of our existence," unquote. This quote indicates a gap and indeed a certain tension between the freedom that pertains to our original upsurge of existence, as she calls it, and the freedom that is actualized through existing. Beauvoir reads this gap as being a gap between what is referred to as, or what is translated as natural or ontological freedom on the one hand, and ethical or moral freedom on the other. She emphasizes the transition from natural to ethical freedom as being contingent on action, willing in this case, and the capacity to make a choice. The emphasis on the category of ethical freedom as genuine freedom increases steadily from the Ethics of Ambiguity into the second sex. In the light of this distinction, I think that it would be philosophically apt to read ontological freedom more as a latent capacity that must be converted into presence through action. If this is the case, then we must critically engage the conditions for the possibility of actions that render freedom possible. In other words, the circumstances in which actions are rendered possible must be an integral part of discerning both the content of freedom and the form that it ultimately takes. The category of ethical freedom in Beauvoir's terms, therefore, equips phenomenology with a distinct vocabulary for theorizing freedom in the context of embodied existence, an existence which plays a real role in determining whether or not freedom can be actualized in the course of a life. I consider the distinction between ontological freedom and ethical freedom to be much more than a simple rhetorical device. If genuine freedom is contingent upon projects and actions, the validation and possibility of which is dependent on my relation to others, then others impact and constitute my freedom at a very fundamental level. The capacity of transcendence as the site of agency, therefore, now becomes tied more intimately to a fundamental interdependence between the self and the other, and the self in situation. It is also interesting to see how the idea of project, which appeared to be very individualistic at first sight, ends up facilitating a move from an individual I to a collective sense of we of the public. Through an extensive use of the critical category of situation later in the second sex, Beauvoir concerns herself even more with the situated nature of human experience, along with the engaged nature of agency or freedom in situation. If we are free in situation, then the configurations of the situation would greatly impact the nature of freedom in question. In the light of Beauvoir's emphasis on the non-foundational character of experience, the analysis of gender oppression in the second sex, and her emphasis on the concept of situation, this is a technical term that arises in the second sex, the importance of ontological freedom, I think, somehow recedes in the background. I find that ontological freedom increasingly appears to become more of a formal orientation, whose utility mainly lies as a normative standard that justifies the need for preserving individual integrity that liberal feminists draw our attention to. In other words, there is equality in terms of the potential to be free, yet by itself this potential is ineffective and insufficient. Therefore, in my reading of Ambiguity in the context of Beauvoir's broader philosophical work, I place far more emphasis on the category of ethical freedom, or freedom as lived for the purpose of moral and political philosophy. The category of ethical freedom, I think, does a couple of important things. It reminds us that agency is critically shaped by our situation, which includes the other. And also that agency is shaped amidst the complex interplay of two apparently contradictory aspects of existence, namely freedom and vulnerability. In other words, we become agents in and through inhabiting the sphere of ambiguity between transcendence and immanence. The ambiguity between transcendence and immanence in Beauvoir's analysis of the character of agency therefore yields another ambiguity, that between the self and the other. I now turn towards this second kind of ambiguity and its implications for the question of reciprocity. This brings me to the last section of today's talk, which is called Rethinking Reciprocity and Solidarity Through Ambiguity. The phenomenology of agency, as articulated in the previous section, points towards a fundamental ambiguity in the border between the self and the other. The nature of one's being cannot be discerned through a soliloquy, neither can it be lived in isolation. It is only through my relationship to the other and in situation that I'm confronted by the realization of my own possibilities as an agent and my own vulnerabilities as a situated being. The increasing emphasis on ethical freedom from the ethics of ambiguity through the second sex further solidifies this fact. In this section, I reconceptualize the concept of reciprocity in the light of my analysis of ambiguity and go on to analyze its implications for a decolonized conception of solidarity. Before I begin, I would like to clarify my use of the term agency and then talk about the implications of a redefined conception of agency for conceptualizing reciprocity. Self-determination that is made possible in the absence of certain constraints is, of course, an aspect of agency. The phenomenological concept of ambiguity as discussed, however, gives us additional resources for thinking about agency. In Beauvoir's phenomenology, the lived experience of agency is also tied to specific temporal spatial orientations of transgressing the given. As transcending towards the unknown and unfamiliar, it puts us in a crisis zone, one of anxiety, fear, and so on. Yet the possibilities it furnishes for curiosity, novelty, etc. is what makes for creativity. In this way, it becomes associated with the power to do things. This is an important contribution of the idea of freedom in Beauvoir. So it becomes associated with the power to do things and to make the world through one's action. Andrea Weltman, another Beauvoir scholar, in fact identifies the use of the term transcendence in the sense of constructive or creative work as being a distinct contribution of Beauvoir in the domain of phenomenology. She argues that Beauvoir brings this unique dimension to the idea of transcendence in phenomenology as world making. Now, on my part, I take this aspect of world making very seriously in discussions of agency, since I think it has important implications for the question of reciprocity. World making must be understood in the context of the kinds of possibilities that are opened up as a result of the action, and by the sort of grip that it provides on the future. Of course, this experience of agency and making the world is not an individual process. We cannot simply be agents in our heads. Our appeals must be acknowledged and responded to by the other. Second important point I want to draw attention to from this is that I think that when we pay serious attention to the ambiguous character of agency, that is agency as being a complex interplay between freedom and vulnerability, and as being tied to world making, we realize that agency and its possibilities are neither located purely in the self nor in the other. It is somewhat located at the boundary space or the space between the two, and by virtue of the interaction between them. This approach, so it can generate a more interactive model for agency, is what I believe. This approach to agency highlights the reciprocal tie between the self and the other. Note a reciprocity that is now rooted in the ambiguous character of agency itself due to the fusion of freedom and unfreedom. Okay, so the reciprocity is starting to look different here. The kind of reciprocity I'm referring to is embodied through and through by emphasizing both our freedom in the sense of potential for transcendence and vulnerability as agents at the same time. The concept of ambiguity enables us to break out of the dichotomous language of subject and object as the dominant lens for looking at intersubjective relations and intersubjective ethical space. That is the space between the self and the other. The emphasis on the ambiguous dimensions of self-other relations as part of one situation also makes this model very different from the ones that emphasize connection and solidarity on the basis of formal or abstract qualities, such as common oppression, which end up covering over material inequalities. In short, I have discussed reciprocity so far in terms of an embodied orientation, which is not a formal feature, but an embodied orientation which is based on the ambiguous character of agency and the ambiguity of the border between the self and the other. It is precisely the materiality of embodiment and the situated nature of intersubjective relations that pushes us to take the specificities of our location seriously. I think that a revised conception of reciprocity based on an acute awareness of the ambiguity and the potential of the border between the self and the other can stipulate important trajectories for relating to the other and for ethical engagement across differences. The initial formulations of this is what I would like to end with. First, it pushes us to actively engage both the points of connection and separation between the self and the other at the same time within the particularities of their respective situations. By emphasizing both our freedom and vulnerability as agents in relation to one another, ambiguity enables us to break out of a dichotomous language of subject versus object, as I said, as the dominant lens for looking at intersubjective relations. Ambiguity rather stipulates that one relate in the dual modality of both subject - object to the other, who is also conceptualized in a similar mode. I'm using subject-object with a hyphen so as to designate an existentially fused category, which is always operative hand in hand, both ontologically and phenomenologically, as against the framing of subject versus object, where the two signify mutually incompatible modes of being. Reciprocity, rethought through this phenomenology of the border between the self and the other, therefore, is effective in combating processes of radical othering or alterity, which often issue in relations of domination and antagonism. Number two, of course, as we become aware of the reciprocal tie between the self and the other, we also realize that there is no final reconciliation. This is not a reciprocity that is pre-given or assumed, but a reciprocity that has to be worked towards. The reciprocity in question is always precarious and in need of more work. An awareness of the power we exercise in relation to the other and the power that the other exercises over us, however, in the very least, situates us as being important and essential to each other. On the other hand, denial of reciprocity means closing off of this possibility even before actual engagement or encounter with the other begins. Denial of reciprocity implies denying the status of peers to the other, which in turn justifies domination and subordination of the other in and because of their difference. In fact, I think that a primary mechanism through which a non-reciprocal orientation towards intersubjective relations results in domination and subordination is precisely through diffusing the other's status as subject, while emphasizing the same for the self as the subject. The other is rendered both ontologically and phenomenologically inessential through radical processes of othering. Rendered thus, the other is reduced to a being in general, to someone who is not this or that unique being considered in all of their specificity, but one who simply is. Being stripped of specificity and individuality, she is also stripped of agency. Non-reciprocal objectification happens because claims about hierarchy are implicit in the essential-inessential distinction. And this is a thing that, again, as I had referred to earlier in the talk, Mohanty points out that through the lens of third world difference, the third world woman becomes the inessential other, against whom the first world woman posits themselves as the essential other. So the essential self, sorry. So non-reciprocal objectification happens because claims about hierarchy are implicit in the essential-inessential distinction, which is part and parcel of a dualistic logic of self and other. Consequently, I think that this logic threatens to confer normalizing force to existing material non-reciprocity, and thus aggravates power differentials within intersubjective relations. However, the alternative framework of reciprocity, which is being developed here, emphasizes the tie between the self and the other, how they are essential for each other. This framework, therefore, is better equipped to avert the threat of non-reciprocal objectification and the consequent threats of epistemological and moral colonialisms. I have discussed reciprocity so far in terms of an embodied orientation, which is based on the ambiguous character of agency and the ambiguity of the border between the self and the other. It is precisely the materiality of embodiment and the situated nature of intersubjective relations which pushes us to take the specificity of our context and social status seriously. To state it otherwise, reciprocity is not conceptualized in terms of abstract qualities such as common oppression, which assumes individuals within a group or identity category to be equal to each other and therefore covers over inequalities and differences. Rather, reciprocity here is conceptualized on the basis of our embodied existence within the realities of our situation, which in turn is characterized by various asymmetries and vulnerabilities. One's power to make the world or unmake it, after all, is deeply tied to the boundaries which frame her experience of agency. The ways in which we make each other's world or unmake it as agents deserves a great deal of attention from the point of view of ethics, therefore. Number 3, reciprocity revisited through ambiguity is also not a simple contractual relation between preformed agents as the liberal paradigm considers it to be, and which has been the source of concern for a wide variety of feminists, including post-colonial and third world feminists. Rather, it demands that we attend to the specifics of the way in which agency manifests itself in a particular case, the means employed for such manifestation, and indeed the politics involved in the very formation of agents. Reciprocity revisited through the lens of ambiguity, therefore, does not entail symmetry. Remember, the symmetry and commensurability connection with reciprocity is what has been subjected to critique earlier in the talk. So reciprocity revisited through the lens of ambiguity does not entail symmetry. This dissociation makes it possible to demand relations on an equal footing, equal respect for each other, even as we expose various differences and inequalities between the parties involved. In other words, reciprocity conceived in an existential phenomenological vein is capable of exposing the nuances of dependencies within relationships, the sort of things that a liberal take on the concept either covers over or simply does not concern itself with. Number 4, ambiguity allows us to talk about relationality, vulnerability, and oppression without sacrificing agency in the process, even among the most vulnerable. It does so by problematizing the agent-victim dichotomy. This orientation, therefore, has significant potential for arresting one-sided conversations and setting the tone for serious engagement and mutual accountability among parties that are unequally situated in terms of material realities. Leaving a space for some account of agency, such as oppositional agency in the middle of oppression, has been particularly important to feminists in order to liberate themselves from the objectifying gaze of patriarchal conceptions. Moreover, defining a liberatory project such as feminism simply through a language of victimization or oppression renders narratives of resistance and narratives of oppression equally thin and simple. Ambiguity, on the other hand, leaves open possibilities for narratives of agency even on the part of the most vulnerable. It does so by problematizing the agent-victim dichotomy. This orientation, therefore, has significant potential for arresting one-sided conversation or one-sided attribution of agency and one-sided versus one-sided attribution of victimization. Number 5, reciprocity thus conceived also opens up a space for incommensurability, the need for which Schutter had highlighted in a decolonizing ethics and which I had discussed earlier in the talk. The recognition of one's vulnerability and openness to the other, along with the agency of the other, leaves a perpetual blind spot in the self, due to which the self can never coincide with itself. The ethic of otherness within oneself shifts the focus of politics from being one that is concerned with projecting the self on the other, so as to make the latter one's mirror image, which is an assimilationist ethics, to one that works on assuming the meanings and obligations of the split within oneself. I think that recognition of the vulnerability in oneself, along with the agency of the other, succeeds in achieving yet another task. The other is an agent whose existential choices, decisions, and actions are enabled and constrained by the nuances of her own situation. There is no way to tell in what way and even whether she will respond to my appeals. Being an agent in situation, therefore, makes the other always retain a degree of unpredictability, a kind of ontological and epistemic gap with respect to the self. The most important point of this potential of this blind spot, I think, for moral and political philosophy is that it helps highlight and maintain a degree of incommensurability between the self and the other, which then prevents this threat of lapsing into the generalized other as the unit of moral discourse. In other words, we find a way to preserve the strangeness of the other, even as we acknowledge the intimate bond between the self and the other. Number 6, the way in which reciprocity has been conceptualized so far accommodates incommensurability between agents in an interactive context. Attributing importance to the blind spot within and without demands that we maintain a certain degree of humility in relation to it, that we listen carefully and attend to it. The dissociation of reciprocity from both symmetry and commensurability and acknowledging the blind spot also complicates our reading of recognition. There's a lot of work that has happened in the ethics of recognition. But here what I want to emphasize to the idea of ambiguity is that recognition is not an easy task when otherness needs to be preserved, and the other is not simply made the mirror image of the self. In fact, as I said, attributing a significance to this blind spot within and without demands that we maintain a certain degree of humility in relation to this phenomenological gap between the self and the other, and we attend to it with care. Reciprocity, reconceived along with its implicit ethic of otherness, therefore, has great potential in anchoring what I consider to be an ethics of humility. In my reading, so from recognition, I'm now sort of moving into an ethics of humility as a component of it. In my reading and development of the concept of ambiguity, I place a lot of theoretical weight on asymmetry and vulnerability, as opposed to the liberal paradigm, just as much as I do on freedom and agency. The philosophical position I end up with, however, may not be perfectly aligned with Beauvoirian existential phenomenology. This is due to the fact that although Beauvoir talks a lot about vulnerability, she continues to maintain a somewhat ambiguous stance on the status of ontological freedom. Consequently, it is not uncommon to assume ontological freedom as being something substantive in its own right. However, in light of my emphasis on ethical freedom and the concept of situation in interpreting the concept of ambiguity, my reading challenges any substantive view of ontological freedom. I attribute great ontological and phenomenological weight to vulnerability, and this leads me to derive an ethics of humility hand in hand with an ethics of recognition from the perspective of ambiguity. I think that an ethical orientation of humility can provide important direction to both theory and praxis of recognition across differences. To end, an ethics of humility, truly speaking, is a border ethics. It is rooted in the recognition of borders and differences both inside and outside the self. An ethical orientation of humility as a way of casting oneself into the world, to use a phrase from Beauvoir's Ethics of Ambiguity, can provide important direction to a politics of recognition. It reminds us that recognition and solidarity are neither easy nor uncomplicated tasks. True recognition must engage what can be recognized, that is, the elements that are commensurable, along with that which cannot be recognized, namely the incommensurable elements. It must give proper place to that which escapes description and must be willing to learn from this gap rather than trying to overcome it. When we attribute sufficient significance to vulnerability as an aspect of reciprocity, then there is significant potential to prevent an abuse of power within relations between moral and political agents. Rethinking recognition in the framework of an ethics of humility, therefore, can pave the way for thinking about solidarity in a decolonial mode. With this, I would end. Thank you for listening to the long talk. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Banerjee, for the enlightening talk. I request Rajvi to moderate the Q&A session.
Thank you, Ma'am Shefali. We are starting with the Q&A session. So before commencing, here is an instruction to all the participants. Participants are requested to type their question in the chat box or may raise their hands by clicking the button at the bottom of the screen to ask the question in person. So yes. Any questions? Professor Anchit Ghosh.
Thank you.
Yes.
We must give credit to what Professor Amrita Banerjee has very nicely given us the ethics of humility and the ethics of recognition. This is one of the new vista that she is trying to open, and we must thank her for that. Now the thing is, I have two things to get clarified, and one is when she was talking about epistemic commensurability and ontological asymmetry. Now, in my opinion, epistemic commensurability is feminine, whereas ontological asymmetry is feminist. So I want to bring a difference between feminine and feminist, because feminine is just to see the things that the voice for the search for something which we want to women's unique position. But a feminist voice is something type of revolt that show ontological asymmetry is feminist, whereas epistemic commensurability is feminine. This is one observation I have made. And the second one is, when she was during the beginning of our lecture trying to give us that we have to proceed from equality, then symmetry, then reciprocity. I think it is just the other way around, from reciprocity, then symmetry, and then equality. So how do you respond to these two things? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ghosh, for your observations. So let me tackle the second question first. Actually, this is how Kite lays out the trajectory in liberal thought, from how the idea of reciprocity is very intimately tied with equality. Reciprocity is understood in terms of equality between parties to the contract, and equality is understood in terms of symmetry and commensurability. So therefore, in a way, all of these fall within a larger master concept, but different paths to it. Because we assume that the different parties are ontologically and epistemologically symmetrical and commensurable to each other, therefore, we can think of reciprocity in terms of equality. And therefore, we also then, which then would mean in the context of, let's say, if we are talking about, and here I'm just to explain, I'm using the category of woman, loosely speaking. And here one would say then, as the traditional liberal feminists do, that because, as women, we sort of, the category itself is internally coherent. And, we all can relate to each other because we suffer from the common oppression of patriarchy. Right. And that, therefore, this is what makes for reciprocity and solidarity within us. And as we have seen, this kind of perspective has come under critique from various places within feminist philosophy itself, including care ethics, women of color feminisms, post-colonial feminisms, and so on. So that is the link. Now, in terms of epistemic incommensurability and ontological incommensurability, partly what I was trying to argue is that, and what with the help of Shrute also I was trying to argue, both Kite and Shrute. Eva Kite, one of the things she's showing is that there's a lot of relations in human life which are relations of dependencies. So, and she in fact says that we all are either actually or potentially dependent. So even those of us who are able-bodied, healthy, independent, autonomous individuals have been a child, have been some mother's child, and will again become dependent perhaps when we become old or we are sick and so on. So Kite's point is that why are we looking at the relation between parties as the basis of a moral ontology in terms of symmetry, whereas the human condition is one of asymmetry? And Shrute's point is that, which she adds, I think, is that apart from the asymmetry, there is also the problem of incommensurability. And if, for instance, even as women, we are divided on the basis of race, caste, gender, citizenship status, so on and so forth, then how is it that we can even say that we all suffered a form of common oppression? And the other critique which which I haven't referred to, comes from Bell Hooks, who's an African-American feminist, and who says, this perspective on feminism is very problematic because it reduces feminism to a good girl and bad boy kind of model, which is very, very problematic. right? And it really does not, does not really construe feminism as an emancipatory philosophy that also connects with struggles against other forms of injustices like racism, casteism, so on and so forth. So therefore, in that way, the incommensurability and the asymmetry both need to be factored in. So there's a descriptive aspect to it, in the sense that, yes, it is a feminine condition often that Kite says, that women often historically and even now continue to be caregivers to children, to the sick, etc. And therefore, they already become more vulnerable, and they cannot exercise their autonomy in that sense because somebody else is dependent on them. So in that sense, it's a feminine condition. But part of the normative ethics that we are trying to draw up is to actually then turn it on itself, subvert that concept, right? Like care, like vulnerability, to derive a feminist position. So you're right to note that the feminine is not necessarily the feminist, right? So that there's a distinction between the two. But starting from the feminine, the attempt is to come up with a feminist ethics across difference, and which is not necessarily only pertinent for women. It, as I said, it can be actually pertinent to other identity categories as well, as we come together in struggles of solidarity against oppression. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ma'am Shefali, you may ask the question.
Thank you, Rajvi. Ma'am, I am working in the area of women and religion, and what I was quite intrigued by the notion of ambiguity. What would you say would be the bearing of the woman's sense of self as vis-a-vis ambiguity in relation to women and religion?
Thank you, Shefali. Actually, so I have not worked on the topic of women and religion at all. So I would, why don't you start with your initial thoughts, and then maybe I can ask it. I think what you ask is a very interesting question, and something again that can be, ambiguity as a philosophical concept can be very useful for thinking about that. But do you, I mean, the connection you're making, what are your initial thoughts? And then I can...
What I was thinking is, if you look at the role of women in religion and how she perceives herself in that religion, the majority of religions being very patriarchal, I feel that the male roles can be very defined, like XYZ are the things to be done by the males. The woman kind of is left a little hanging there, because she always sees herself through some other roles, but she doesn't see herself as herself. So there is this sense of loss of, a persona, you may call it, or what she stands for. There are specific roles for her as the wife, as the mother, these kind. But what about her as her? I even found, when you look at the creation stories, it kind of, always a woman is made for somebody. A man was alone, so she came. But I always feel, what about she being created for herself? She has a right to exist on her own, not needing anybody. So somewhere even I feel that religion has, made her very ambiguous. She's just like an appendage at best, So I was listening to you speaking about ambiguity, and I just felt that that's exactly what a woman feels in her religion. And even us as religion participating in faiths, if you are not tagged with someone, you never really know where you stand. Okay, so
so I think from what you say, and I'm trying to think with you here again, because I'm not an expert on that topic, but I think a couple of things. One is that taking ambiguity as a phenomenological concept in order to understand both the self and the self in relation to the other, right? So in what you're saying, I think, so ambiguity, one of the things it's doing is bringing out both the relationality, right, aspect of the self, the fact that the self is the self in relation, and also the vulnerability aspect of the self in the relation itself. Right. And here I because I'm constrained for time, I couldn't really go into the details of it, but Beauvoir actually proposes ambiguity as and ambiguity as a site of agency, as an alternative to the understanding of freedom that Sartre gives, at least in the early works, including Being and Nothingness, where he's making a kind of stark distinction between the in itself and the for itself. Right. And he's locating freedom on one side. And Beauvoir, by proposing the distinction between ontological and ethical freedom, and then subsequently talking about ambiguity, actually challenges this dichotomy and says, no, freedom is always in relation. Freedom is not just the pure act of transcendence, but freedom also involves vulnerability, right? So transcendence and immanence are not in a dichotomy, but they're operating in a way such that freedom is made possible. Right. So in that context, I think from what you're saying, the concept might be useful. You'll have to think more in terms of the description of the relational aspect of women in the context of our existence in a religion or religious practice, right? Where you're saying that there's always a dilution of the self and the relation with the other, right? But on the other hand, I think what I have been talking about in terms of then mobilizing the concept of ambiguity to think about a more empowering ethics, right? In the sense that the danger of so partly in this understanding of relationality that you are showing, that the woman is always becomes lesser of the self, or woman, if I understand it correctly, is a lack rather than the self in a religious practice, right? Yeah. So in that sense, there is a threat to non-reciprocal objectification, like I have pointed out, right, extensively. That the self becomes the essential, and the non-self becomes inessential, right? The other becomes inessential. So ambiguity, however, also allows us to overcome this kind of non-reciprocal objectification, because it reminds the self that the self is also ambiguous, right? The problem is that only when we are looking at the other, we are attributing lack of agency there. We are only thinking of the other as in relation to the self. But the beauty of the concept of ambiguity in Beauvoir, I find, is that it reminds the self that it is only the self in relation to the other, right? So in that sense, it actually levels out a little bit of this hierarchy. Okay. So there could be a kind of a normative project, in the sense of a philosophically normative project, that one can also, inaugurate or extract from the problematic aspects of relationality. So it's only better forms of relationality that are going to overcome the dangers of more problematic kinds of relationality. Is the point that I want to emphasize also. Okay. But thank you. I think that's a great question, and that's a great research question to keep thinking about, actually.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Thanks, Radvi. Thanks, Professor Amrita Banerjee. It's a very wonderful talk. As I understand, while you were making your presentation, the shift from the ethics of recognition to ethics of humility that you are proposing, I think the significant point to be noted is that in the ethics of recognition, there is a happening of what you call the erasure of the strangeness, the strangeness of the other. And perhaps, this erasure is what problematizes the self in various contexts, particularly in transnational ethics. So to that extent, I understand the point that you are making, and ethics of humility would be much more, significant in that context. But at the same time, I was wondering if we live with only the ethics of humility, would it also to some extent jeopardize our ability to address the other, which an ethics of recognition provides? That's just a kind of doubt that I have. So I just want to know your thoughts on it. Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you so much. One of the things I want to clarify at the outset, though, is that I'm not saying that the ethics of recognition becomes unimportant. But I think, and in fact, Beauvoir also sort of offers a kind of ethics of recognition, which may be different from some other varieties that come out of more liberal strands of moral and political theory. So what I propose, though, is that, like you rightly noted, partly in the whole discussion of recognition, the commensurability and the symmetry clauses have not really been conceptually attended to the point they should have. So humility there brings in certain dimensions to the ethics of recognition. So humility and recognition need not be two contradictory kind of ethic, but rather the ethics of recognition actually can be enriched or turned into new directions through the ethics of humility. And in the ethics of recognition also, I think from a feminist philosophical perspective, if we look at the older versions of the ethics of recognition, etc., I think there are certain further problems in the sense that the very idea of the viewpoint of the other or the standpoint of the other is not really problematized, right? So actually feminist epistemologists over the last 10, 15 years or 20 years even have problematized the notions of standpoint, for instance, in very many ways, right? So standpoint is again something that needs to be achieved. So even when we talk about recognition of the other and group relations, both groups on both sides of the relation are actually also heterogeneous units. That's why I was kind of starting to say that in a way, no reified understanding of group should come into the picture. That would be problematic, because then there are minority voices within a group, whether they are on the side of privilege or whether they are on the side of oppression, right? And so again, with ethics of recognition, I don't think it does justice to a very dynamic understanding of group identity per se. It can become very culturally essentialistic, right? And then how do you factor in epistemological, phenomenological, and ontological asymmetry and commensurability? So there, I think humility can actually contributes in a few ways, in the sense that it opens up, it really conceptually does something with the blind spot in the self and outside the self, right? And so, as I was saying, that therefore the ethics of humility has the potential to become a kind of border ethic, in the sense that the claim of moral entitlement is actually located at the border between the self and the other, rather than purely in the self or purely in the other, right? And ambiguity basically helps us to a certain extent to see this. Ethics of recognition need not necessarily be a border ethic, right? It might become assimilist, or it might become one of radical alterity also, right? So even within certain strands, people have argued, like, that we therefore need to just celebrate the otherness of the other, right? But here there is I think a different end that is coming into the picture in terms of the relationship. So the moral claim is based on the relation between the self and the other, and that is where it contributes. But I think it can actually enrich an ethics of recognition in many ways. Thank you for that question. That helped.
Thank you. That clarifies my worry. Thanks for the clarification. Thank
you. We have a question coming by Lakshmi Devi. It says, I felt humility should be one of the ethics of recognition as understood from your lecture today, ma'am. Thanks. Okay, this is not a question. Sorry.
And thank you, Lakshmi, for that, because that's precisely the case in a way that ethics of humility is something that actually helps us to rethink the very idea of recognition. What is it involved? Is it again a recognition towards a generalized other or a concrete other? Right. What does recognition mean in the context of problematic asymmetry? Right. So in the context of transnational ethics or ethics of difference, we are often talking about relations where one group is on the side of privilege and benefiting from the oppression of the other group. Right. What does recognition mean there is a big question. Does understanding that the other group comes from a different place, is it enough? Or for a moral framework, or is more needed? So thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Any questions? Okay, so if there are no, yes, Aditi.
Yes, ma'am. Just to add to what Shefali ma'am had just asked about religion, I would like to take it even back. Some of the philosophies or ancient religions don't give the right to liberation to women. And is it, I mean, I'm asking your opinion, has this notion of denying the right to liberation, that is the ultimate goal of your life, according to many of these religions and philosophies, has this seeped into from philosophy to religion to cultural biases and to then to the societal at large bias that we see towards women? And what kind of relations we can draw from these connections or interconnections to the marginalized groups or to various other nationalities, like, or direct references from some of the tribal population which do have a matriarchal societies or groups. And so what will be the connection, or will this be a gross generalization?
So the point about how these aspects come about in society is, of course, a big question, and hard to sort of give an opinion straightforwardly on that. But of course, as a philosopher, I would say that that philosophy itself is, as we read philosophy itself is a response to the times, right, and to a larger context. So philosophy absorbs ideas from which it is born, right? And on the other hand, then philosophy also fuels social conceptions, ways we think about ourselves, ways we engage in practices, so on and so forth. So I would say the relation is quite dynamic between all these things, philosophy, religion, and ultimately, when it comes down to rituals, social practices, so on and so forth, right? So I think that's a larger point about the place of philosophy or the place of religion in how we understand ourselves, how we respond to the other, right? So as we are thinking about responding to the other or self and the other, remember, one of the things that is very important when we're talking about relations are institutions. And religion is one such institution. So when Beauvoir, in the entire Second Sex, when she actually takes up different institutions. So she takes up the institution of motherhood. She takes up the institution of marriage, right? So perhaps like that, one could also take up the institution of religion and think about what relationality means in that context. Now, in terms of patriarchal versus matriarchal, now within feminism, of course, there's, and within feminist philosophy particularly, there are different, there's a lot of heterogeneity of views. So some feminist philosophers would say that, that in order to do away with patriarchy, we need to look at matriarchal societies. Now, on the one hand, that could be beneficial to a certain extent in the sense that it gives us alternative imaginations. But on the other hand, there is an equal danger of romanticizing problems within these sort of frameworks, right? So I would say that when when we look at, so just as I was saying that the liberal notion of reciprocity needs to be taken into critique, or needs to be critiqued, and also then the turn away from reciprocity might be problematic. In the same way, I would say that, thinking of matriarchy as the alternative to patriarchy, actually that sort of again results in a kind of binary viewpoint on the world, number one. And secondly, they both can be equally disempowering in certain cases, because we are not really rethinking power in a dynamic way. So here it's still a top-down model of power that is there, right? So now we shift power from basically a hitherto disempowered group to an empowered group. That's all. And actually, in some other work, I have argued, and Chandra Mohanty also has made certain arguments in terms of the fact that, simply now making the slaves the new masters does not really does not really undo oppression, because now the new masters are going to enslave the old. So therefore, so I am on my part, I am a little apprehensive of these binary conceptualizations. And I think philosophically, it is worth actually critically engaging with both to then derive a feminist viewpoint from that. So again, going back to the point that feminine need not be feminist, right? So just because a society is matriarchal may not mean that it is a feminist lens. That is something that has to be developed meticulously. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have another question coming from Sanket Revankar. In the ethics of recognition, can we include Pratyabhijna philosophy as a metaphysical position of recognition of the self from Kashmir's Shaivism, or we exclude it to oppose feminism as the Shaiva theory of ontology?
Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, I have very little knowledge of Kashmiri Shaivism. I know that tradition is very interesting. And I actually have a colleague who has been hired, recently, who works on Kashmiri Shaivism. And I hope to learn more from him in terms of, in our conversations. So I cannot I right now cannot actually answer your question in terms of whether it would contribute to a feminist understanding or not. However, there are two different ways, sometimes even among, so the Pratyabhijna in Shaivism is particularly, I don't know, so I cannot speak to it. But one of the things I do support, and I think is an interesting way of doing philosophy, is also to bring in different hermeneutics of reading and interpreting traditions. So, for instance, there could be a tradition which is extremely, or at the face of it, could be leading to patriarchal conceptions, right? But through a kind of critical feminist lens, one could both critique and resurrect something from it. So that possibility, I think, is there, and a lot of innovation is needed to do these extractions. And feminists have done this with many sort of outright patriarchal positions, such as that of Aristotle's or Kant's, right? So I hope in the Indian traditions also, this possibility is there, and there is, of course, work along these lines as well. I, unfortunately, because I'm not familiar with the Kashmiri Shaivist tradition at all, I cannot answer the question. Sorry. But I hope somebody takes it up in their research. That would be a good, that would be a very interesting research project, I would say.
Thank you, ma'am. Any questions? there are no any further questions, then we are concluding the session. If any participant wishes to discuss their questions, may kindly correspond with the speaker over mail. Thank you all, and thank you, Dr. Amrita Banerjee. Thank you so much. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Rajvi. I request Aditi to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Shefali ma'am. First and foremost, I thank Professor Banerjee for such an illuminating talk. It gave us a lot of new perspectives and a lot of food for our thoughts. The talk was not only remarkable in its contents, but also in the structured way that it was delivered. We learned a lot from that as well. I thank Professor Koshi, Dean of School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies. Your support always pushes us forward in all our ventures. I thank all the faculty members, both in and out of the school. Thank you for taking time off of your schedule and supporting us in our event. I thank all the participants from and outside Goa University. Your presence makes these talks a success. And lastly, I thank all of the research scholars in the school. It's because of your participation we can successfully organize such talks. A special thanks to those who have helped in designing the poster with event promotion and coordination. Thank you. Back to you, Shefali ma'am.
Thanks a
Thank
lot,
you, Aditi.
Professor Amrita Banerjee. And just take note, there are now some of the references available in the chat box too. Once again, from my side, my
Thank you
personal
so
thanks.
much.
Professor
It has
Amrita.
been
Back
a
to you,
great
Shefali.
pleasure, and I
Thank you,
really
sir.
enjoyed the questions that were posed, and there are many research projects to be taken up in the questions. So I hope some of the research scholars are thinking along those lines. So thank you again, and special thanks to Koshi as well.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. The event concludes. Before we sign off, I would like to remind everyone that the recording of this lecture shall be posted on the YouTube channel of the school, and there will be another guest lecture held, so details will be sent. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you.